It's ad break time. The Beyond Solitaire podcast is proudly sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations, which, as usual, has amazing things going on. They continue to run courses in applied game design in partnership with Gen Con. And next up is Travis Hill's Finding Your Niche, expanding your skill set across 5 different gaming genres. It starts May 16th, so register soon. I also want to put in a plug for Cartini from Darkness to Light, a game by Zenobia finalist Sharia Iwandini that will be published by Ion Game Design. CMU is partnering with Ion to publish a curriculum guide, which will be authored by the amazing Christiane Hintz. Cartini is set to launch on Kickstarter on May 23rd. And finally, a quick plug for myself. If you like my game work and want to see more of it, support me at patreon.com/beyondsolitaire. It would mean a whole lot to me. For now, though, let's get on with the show. Hey, gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I have a very special guest on the pod this week. This is game designer Alex Knight. How you doing, Alex?
Great. Good to be with you, Liz.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Thanks for getting up early on a Saturday morning to talk to me. But you have just had your very first game design make it out into the world. So tell us about your game.
Yeah, so Land and Freedom, the Spanish Revolution Civil War was just released by Blue Panther in February. It's my first published game and it basically covers the semi-cooperative struggle of the different Republican factions during the Spanish Civil War. We're defending the Spanish Republic from the fascist attack, which is coming basically automated in the game. So the players are working together to win the war against the fascists, and then they're also fighting each other for political initiative. So it's really tense, sort of tight tug of war between 1 to 3 players.
Yes, and so for full disclosure, everybody out there, I have played this game. I think it's a really good time. It's tough to win.
Yeah.
So we'll get there. This game was 5 years in the making, you said. So why did it take 5 years, and where did it start for you?
Yeah, I mean, it took 5 years because it was my first design and I'm a new designer and I'd never done this before, really. So my very first prototypes were very, very rough, and it started out more as a typical sort of war game with a lot of units and a lot of battles and a lot of military stuff going on, and that kind of overwhelmed the part of the game that I really wanted to highlight, or the part of the history that I really wanted to highlight through the game, which is the revolutionary side of the Spanish Revolution and Civil War. Because you had all this inspiring, movement of workers and women and all these people who are self-empowering, millions of people involved in those struggles. And I didn't want to just make a war game. And so in order to sort of shift the focus towards those elements of what happened, I needed to greatly simplify and abstract the actual combat, and make sure that the cooperative combat side of the game was given equal weight, not more weight, to the political revolutionary side of the game. So it took me quite a long time to figure out exactly how to do that. And playing Watergate, the excellent Matthias Kramer game, which is a quite simple tug of war about a very interesting historical topic, that kind of blew my mind and gave me a lot of new ideas for how to restructure my game. And so that was one of the major turning points in my design.
Fantastic. Was this always going to be semi-cooperative, or did you have other ideas in mind in the beginning?
It was always going to be semi-cooperative. In the very, very beginning, it was originally up to 5 player game, and there were 2 different fascist factions as well. I ended up eliminating those and just automating the fascists into decks of 3 years. But the intent all along was to show this fragile alliance of the different Republican factions who are, desperately need to, on the one hand, work together to save the country and their lives, but then at the very same time, can't trust each other at all and must at the same time pursue their political objectives or revolutionary objectives. That's what's really fascinating to me about about the Spanish Civil War. And when I first read about the topic through George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, that was really what stood out to me. It was this desperate struggle of like, we're literally at war with fascism right now, but then behind the lines, there's all this political infighting and backstabbing that's going on that you're fighting on fronts. And that's just so realistic to me. Being involved in any social movements for change is you're constantly having that struggle within the struggle that I really wanted to highlight.
So you've given us a hint in your previous comments, but how did you get interested in the Spanish Civil War to this extent? Does it have any ties to your personal life or your background, or is it just like a historical event that has caught you and you just need to spend time with it?
It's a lot of things. My mother lived in Spain when she was studying abroad in the 60s. And then when I was growing up outside Philadelphia, she was a Spanish teacher. And so I've always had some connection or admired the Spanish language and Spain. And unfortunately, I've only traveled to that country once. I'm really desperate to go back, but I do have that sort of personal connection through my mother. And then, like I sort of alluded to in my own background with organizing and activism, the Spanish Revolution is always one of those touchstones that is really important for radical history. And, one of the most important political events of the 20th century, where you had, like I said, anarchism, communism, anti-fascism, all these really big topics that were on full display in such a dramatic way. So I've always felt, connected to that history for that reason as well.
So I know basically nothing about the Spanish Civil War, except that I've played your games and I feel like I at least know something. But you mentioned that there were different ways to divide up factions and that you originally had 5 players. When you have 3 players representing moderates, communists, and anarchists, what is being elided there? And what kind of nuances are missing? Like, did it have to be those 3 groups, or could you have done it differently and made a choice?
You certainly could complicate it more. I mean, it's a very complicated subject. I've read so many different books that complicate that history, right? You could have multiple anarchist factions, right? There were anarchists who were collaborating with the government, with the Republic, who had positions within the government. There were other anarchists who were much more revolutionary that were totally opposed to collaborating with the government. The communist faction is complicated because it includes revolutionary socialists who are not part of the Communist Party in the communist deck in the game. You also have the issue of the POUM, which was a anti-Stalinist communist party in Spain that was a Marxist party, but it was repressed viciously by the Communist Party under Stalin's orders. So, that is in the game that the leader of the POUM, Andres Nin, was arrested on false pretense under orders from the NKVD by the Soviet Union, and he was tortured to death. But they're another, faction that doesn't fully, it's not playable in the game. And in terms of the moderate faction too, I mean, there were huge regionalist movements at the time where the Basque, movement was very important. They were advocating for Basque independence, or at least autonomy from Spain. And the same thing in Catalonia, right? The Catalonian regionalist or nationalist movement was very important at the time. And those have just kind of been simplified to part of the moderate faction of basically being anti-fascist, but not necessarily anti-capitalist.
That's really interesting. And then, I think that this game comes at a really interesting time, especially in the United States, where things like communist are used as sort of like as an insult. But we have, an attempt to run a Republican government against fascism with, people representing movements that either we vilify here in the United States, or that we just don't understand at all. Like, I think the joke about anarchists is always like, oh, well, why would they be involved in the government at all? Don't they not believe in that?
Right.
So how did you, I guess, work to communicate the seriousness of these social movements to an audience that might know nothing about them through this game?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of history on the cards. Obviously, when you're playing a CDG, it's a relatively quick playing game. The tendency is not to actually read all the history text on the cards, right? And my cards have quite a lot of history text. There's at least a sentence or two on each card. So I don't expect players to be, sitting down and reading each and every card in their hand before deciding which card they're going to play on their turn. But if someone is interested in the history, it's all there on the cards, which was really important to me. And I didn't really include quite a lot of author's notes or designer's notes to detail my perspective on the history, because I didn't want to. It's very controversial. The Spanish Revolution and Civil War is massively controversial, and every ideological stripe has their own perspective on why it went wrong or why the Republic fell. But the cards themselves contain quite a lot of information I mean, my perspective, of course, is part of it, but I wanted to keep it, generic in terms of, most people who wanted to know about Spain could read the cards, and even if you don't necessarily completely agree with my perspective, at least get a really good understanding of, what happened and who were the major players and events and characters that were involved in that struggle. So as far as the different factions, the way that the tracks work, because there's 5 different political tracks or revolutionary tracks on the right side of the board that the players are competing over. And they kind of speak quite a lot to the incentives of these 3 factions, right? The anarchists are fighting for liberty and collectivization. Those are their 2 revolutionary tracks. If they sort of max them out, then the revolution is ascendant, and the anarchists have the initiative regardless of the government, right? For the other factions, they're fighting over the government. The moderates and the communists want to control the government. They also want to knock down the anarchists. And then each of them also has a foreign aid track, because the communists were very dependent on Soviet support, right? The Soviet Union was one of the very few nations that was supporting the Spanish Republic with arms and fighters. And so that's super important to the communist player in the game. And then for the moderate player, they're trying to get the support of France and the UK and the US through their own foreign aid track. And in real life, the fact that France and the UK and the US did not really give much foreign aid, or in fact actually set up a naval blockade to prevent weapons from reaching the Republic, was greatly important in why the Republic ultimately fell, because of course the Italians and the German fascists were supplying, hundreds of thousands of men and weapons and planes and everything to Franco and the Spanish fascists. And that is, a really important theme in the history that's depicted in the game.
Yeah, actually, I had been meaning to ask about the tracks next, because they are really interesting. The communists and the moderates have government, and Soviet support and foreign aid, as you mentioned. Whereas it feels like the anarchist tracks are more ideological, or at least they look like that to me. I don't actually know what people were technically doing on the ground in Spain at this time, but liberty and collectivization have a really different kind of vibe from Soviet support, foreign aid, government. Are these tracks meant to represent something ideological, or are they meant to represent something that's actually happening politically in the country? And would those be things that the moderates and communists did not support, or were they just anarchist priorities more than other groups?
Yeah, so that's a great question. They actually do represent practice, not just ideas, right? So the collectivization track is supposed to represent the actual collectivization of industry and land that the anarchists were involved in at the time. So the CNT union was the largest union in Spain at the time, and it was anarchist led. And along with that union, and independent of the union too, peasants were taking over the land in huge numbers. Before the Civil War began, most workers in Spain were peasants, and many of them were illiterate. They had, it was not very modernized as a country. And, I think 2% of Spanish landowners controlled 2/3 of all agricultural land. So it wasn't, slavery, but it was very repressive in terms of the discrepancy between rich and poor. And so when the revolution began, these peasants began organizing themselves and just taking the land and running it themselves democratically, and distributing their labor and organizing their labor such that they really controlled the agricultural production of the republic. The peasants directly collectivized a majority of agriculture production in the republic during the war. And so that is a very practical thing. Collectivization also happened in the industries, right? In Barcelona alone, there were over 3,000 collectivized enterprises, including public transit, the utilities, right? The electricity, virtually every industry, weapons production was controlled directly by the workers. So the workers actually, were self-managing the economy of the republic to a large degree. And so the moderates and the communists were opposed to this, right? They were trying to stop this level of revolution because they wanted to get the support of the British and the French and the sort of the capitalist powers, if you will, who obviously were not in favor of an anarchist revolution in Spain. So in order to try to win that support of these foreign powers, they were instituting, counter-revolutionary measures, both in the factories and also in the farmlands. The communists, in particular, sent an entire division to Aragon to just decollectivize farms, and they repressed quite a lot of peasants who had controlled production in that area, and the military, the army, was sent to break up the collectives and give the land back to the previous landowners.
Oh man. Yeah, it's kind of depressing actually. So I will admit I know very little about anarchism as an actual political position. I read a little bit of Emma Goldman in high school out of curiosity and then just stopped. So, when we say anarchism and an anarchist revolution, what does that actually mean? Because I feel like you could just toss it and be like, oh, these people don't want any sort of control and it's just crazy and all that. But that doesn't sound like what's happening here. This just sounds like a really big union.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's a tough question to answer because even within anarchism, there's so many different strains of it, right? There's individualists, there's syndicalists, which is more what is represented in the game in terms of organizing through unions. And then there's anarcho-communists, there's anarcho-primitivists. I mean, you could go on and on and on. The history of Spain is really tied to the anarcho-syndicalist movement, which was probably at its zenith, at its peak in the 30s, and particularly in Spain. It was always the most organized anarchist movement in the world. So what they were advocating for was the workers having a general strike to directly challenge capitalist authority and gain workers' control of production. So the Spanish Revolution was largely the culmination of, some 60, 70 years of organizing amongst that community and amongst the radical workers of Spain, who had always been the most receptive to anarcho-syndicalist ideas. And there was quite a lot of controversy when the anarchists actually joined the Republican government in 1936 because of the anti-fascist alliance that they were a part of, and the need to work together with these other political tendencies to preserve, to not lose to the fascists in the war. So that the fact that they entered the government was a huge controversy. Many anarchists outside of Spain and within Spain, but particularly outside of Spain, denounced them for collaborating with with the state. Emma Goldman, in particular, was a very fascinating figure because in her letters, well, she visited Spain on 3 occasions during the war and toured the different collectives and experiments that were going on in Spain. She has there's an excellent collection of her writings on the topic called Vision on Fire that I've been reading lately. But she's one of the few people that it's hard to find people who have a nuanced perspective on the revolution in Spain and don't just either denounce the whole thing or denounce the CNT leadership for collaborating with the government, or denounce the revolutionary anarchists for not helping more or being too revolutionary. There's so many people who obviously were scarred and are bitter because of the failure there. Hundreds of thousands of people were driven out of Spain for basically 40 years if they didn't die. So there's quite a lot of animosity that you can find in anything you read about the Spanish Civil War. Emma Goldman is one of the few people who I think had a pretty nuanced perspective of saying, yeah, maybe it wasn't the best to collaborate with the state for the anarchists, but on the other hand, you can understand the pressure that they were under in being at war with not just the Spanish fascists, but also essentially at war with Italy and Germany. The pressures that these folks were under, and just trying to understand, putting yourself in their shoes as much as you can to understand the situation that they were in. It's been quite a tearing circumstances to have to make very important political decisions under. And my game is not that serious in terms of life or death, but I do want the players to feel some of that tension of like, oh boy, we really need to work together here because our fronts are getting smashed by the fascists. But on the other hand, I can't trust these other players, and I really need to advocate for my own political objectives. And I really wanted to have players feel that push and pull, or that balancing act. That was really important to me.
Yeah, and I noticed that you did do a very good job of that. This game is tough to win, or it's not only tough to win, it's tough to get to the point where you could have a winner because the fascists are so nasty and the temptations to be selfish are so strong.
Yeah.
So how did you build that in? Like, it seems to me that those more powerful card events are particularly tempting and also not that great on the military fronts most of the time. Was that by design? And like, how did you arrive at that pattern within your game, if so?
Yeah, there's an interesting dilemma that you're speaking to in the game of, should I play the card for the event, but then I'm trashing it from my deck? Or should I build a tableau, which is going to be a little bit more of a slow, steady process and a slow build? And I like that tension. I like the idea of short-term versus long-term. As you're mentioning, many of the events have a great short-term effect that is primarily selfish, right? If you're, let's say, the moderates, you might play an event that's going to do a number of really great selfish things for you. It'll maybe push up foreign aid. It'll maybe move the government towards the right, towards the moderates, and maybe even screw the anarchists a little bit too and knock down, let's say, collectivization. But maybe that card doesn't really help you win the war, and that's somewhat intentional, right? I want to, again, to build that fragile alliance tension of, how selfish am I going to be here? Like, there are opportunities in the game for you to be very selfish, but you're risking the whole game if you do that sometimes, right? And that's supposed to illustrate that tension that people were in. And I like that. I like that, if you you have to find the right moment to be really selfish, because maybe, one of the aspects of the game is that there's a test on a front every turn. One of the four fronts is tested every turn by the current fascist card. And depending on the test, it will give a reward if you manage to boost up the front to a certain level at the end of the turn. That reward might be for one particular player, but it also might be for everyone. And if you fail the test by not boosting up that front, there'll be some, negative consequence, which again could affect only one player or it could affect everyone. So there are plenty of times where everyone has an incentive to pass a certain test, but maybe there's one player who has more of an incentive to pass that test. And so, they're pulled more towards the front on that particular turn. And there are other times where you might actively want a test to fail because it would be politically advantageous to you if it failed. Maybe it's going to punish a different player. So that might be the right time to suddenly throw out a really selfish card and be like, okay, great. If I can help this test fail at the same time as I'm pursuing my own political objectives, maybe this is the turn to do that. But again, you might be risking losing that front permanently or losing even the war. Because if you lose two fronts in the game, you've lost the war. Or if you lose Madrid, you've lost the war. So that's one of my favorite things about the game, is that very spicy moment when it's like, okay, now's the time. I'm going to really strike out for my own advantage, even though, I know consciously I'm running the risk of screwing all of us.
Yes, having played this game, I have been there. Woo-hoo. And this game does have solo bots, which are fun, but I will say that it's much more fun to look somebody else in the eye and then screw them over.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's
or yell at David for his decisions.
Yeah, there's plenty of opportunity. Like, I love how many times players can, harangue each other and try to, like you're saying, look someone in the eyes and say, we really need your support on the Aragon front this turn. What are you doing? And berating each other and complaining and all that kind of stuff. And I feel like it's often true that whoever is complaining the loudest is particularly suspect of being the person who's actually contributing the least. So there's so much fun opportunity for table talk. It was important to me and to the publisher that we have the Solitaire bots, and that so you can definitely play the game with one player or two players. That's important, but I agree that the best experience is when you have three players and you can really sort of dig into each other a little bit with table talk.
Absolutely. So the thing that's kind of interesting about this game is how few cards each player actually has. You just have like a little deck of 18, and some of them get scrapped depending on whether you're using them for the events or not. There's like a very tight little resource economy to work with here. And, that's interesting because it leads to tight play decisions. But I also wonder, like, because there was so much going on historically, and every single one of these cards has like a historical name, a historical image, and tied to a real event, was it difficult to boil each movement down to so few cards in terms of what you wanted to communicate as well as what you wanted to happen in play?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly plenty of other people, figures, and events that could have been included that weren't. I feel like I captured the most important ones for me that illustrate how that faction was involved in the war effort, maybe through a particular battle, and also their political figures and political objectives. So it was difficult to condense it down to 18 cards, but I thought 18 was the right number in terms of you want to have a little bit of cycling through your deck, because you at the end of each year, there's 3 years in the game. At the end of each year, you're going to discard most of your cards from your hand and from your tableau, and then those will eventually get shuffled back into your deck, and you'll draw them again, or you may draw them again depending on how many cards you're drawing. But yeah, I wanted a little bit of cycling through the deck, but at the same time, it's not a deck builder. It's not, the focus of the game is not so much on deck building or in deck management, although it is definitely one of the important elements. And probably the most important way that comes through the game is through the final bid for glory, which is on the last turn of the game. Each of the 3 factions will make a bid for glory using up to 3 cards from their hand. Whoever bids the most action points will win that final bid, and that's one of the final points towards the final score. The score I didn't mention is whoever has the most glory at the end of the game, assuming you win the war, right? You have to win the war first, but if you do, whoever has the most glory will win the game, and most of that will be determined by a bag that you're building throughout the course of the game by whoever has the initiative. That player gets to add one of their tokens to the bag at the end of every turn. So it's mostly somewhat random, although of course you want to put as many of your tokens in the bag as you can to increase your odds. The one part of the score that's not random at all is that bid for glory. So whoever's managing their deck the best has a really good chance of winning that bid. But again, that's only 1 point out of the total of 9 that are available. So it is basically, it's one of the strategic options is you can really focus on your 18 card deck and making sure you have the right cards at the right time, but you don't have to do that to win the game. It's just one of the levers that you can try to pull.
Yeah, I actually thought that the Bag of Glory was a very interesting addition to this game because, okay, so there are 12 turns in the game. Everybody adds one of their tokens at the start just to have it. And then there are occasional opportunities like getting a medallion where you can add add one of your tokens to this bag.
Yeah.
So depending on, how well you're counting, if you're letting somebody run away with it, like maybe the results of the game are a foregone conclusion, but not necessarily.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that makes this one interesting, especially because in semi-cooperative games, it's so tempting to just be like, screw it, let the fascists win because I hate you so much right now.
Yeah. Not talking about anyone in particular there, I guess.
Nope, never. I've never felt that way. No joking.
Yeah.
But I like it's a mystery to the end who's actually going to win it. I can see some people perceiving it as unfair, like, oh, I got the most tokens in there, shouldn't I win? But I don't think politics works that way or the history works that way.
Right, exactly. And in my experience, it's really fun. Most of the time, most of the groups that I've watched play, it is a point of discussion. If you had the best odds because you had the most tokens in the bag and they just weren't pulled and you didn't win, that makes for a really fun moment of, wait a second, let me see what's in that bag, and then dumping it out and looking at all the tokens and then counting out who put in the most, because in some ways that indicates who played the best. And so I think some players will take solace in the fact that, oh, well, I put the most tokens in, so even though they weren't pulled, I know I sort of won in my own mind. You can look at it that way. Of course, another way to look at it is I was the most selfish, and that's why I have the most tokens in the bag, not necessarily that I was the best teammate. But I like that, even first, I certainly can imagine some players, cursing the bag and being upset that they didn't get the luck in terms of what was pulled. But I think more frequently I've seen players immediately go to the bag wanting to see what was in there, and then depending on how many tokens they had in the bag, that sort of is what they are going to self-evaluate how they played on. But as you mentioned, like if you fall the semi-cooperative problem, right? If you fall behind in the in the competitive side of the game, you might withdraw more from the cooperative side. Sorry, I can't talk. If you fall behind competitively, you might stop cooperating. That's kind of the semi-cooperative problem that in earlier versions of the game, I really had to tackle because I didn't quite know how to solve that problem. And the bag is really what solved it, because the level of uncertainty that the bag provides means you never really know exactly how well you're doing in the competitive side. And for that reason, you always have to commit to both. You always have to commit to the competitive side to try to maximize your tokens in the bag. Then you also still have to remain engaged in the cooperative side, because you can't risk losing the war, because you don't know whether you're going to win that bag draw at the end. And it was very intentional on my part that even if you had never held the initiative for the first 11 turns of the game, you still have a chance to win the game, even if it's a very small chance, because like you said, you start with one token in the bag. Everyone does. And then the last turn of the game, whoever holds the initiative will get to add 2 more tokens to the bag, one for the end of the turn and one for because it's the end of the year also. So if you had up to this point only had 1 token in the bag the entire game, you could seize the initiative on the last turn, put 2 more tokens in, and then by having the initiative, you also have the tie break. So if you're lucky enough, and it's a small percentage, but if you're lucky enough to pull all 3 of your tokens out of that bag, you could win the game on a 3-3-3 tiebreak. And so that was very important, because you never want any one of the players to feel like, okay, well, I can't win now. No, you still can, even at that point. Even if you've done a terrible job and you've never held the initiative the entire game, you're still not technically out of it. So you can't totally abandon the war.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I like that. So you mentioned earlier that you tried to kind of keep your own perspective out of the game, but I don't think that anybody can fully do that. So
Right.
on reflection, looking at your work, where are the parts where your viewpoints kind of peek through the most?
That's a really awesome question. I think one of the things that was most important to me in this design was to really center the experience of women, and Spanish women in particular, in the game. And so, the cover is a miliciana, a female militia worker, fighter in Spain. It's a really there's actually a film called Libertarias about the uh, women who fought in the militias in Spain. Um, and there's been quite a lot of written about it and so forth. It was in some ways it was overblown how many women were involved. In other ways, it was really an important expression of gender equality, that the sexual revolution that was being pursued by women, and particularly by anarchist women. And I really wanted that to be front and center, that women were very involved in this conflict, and they were very important in this conflict. Much of the leadership of the different factions were women, right? Dolores Ibarruri, I always have trouble with her name. She's the leader of the communist faction in the game. There are multiple cards about women fighting in the militias, or the government banning them from fighting in the militias and trying to force them back into more of a housewife role, or more of a just worker role. But that was probably the most important thing that I wanted to inject into this, to show that women, whether they were in Mujeres Libres, the organized Free Women of Spain, as it's translated, to directly advocate for gender equality, whether in the workplace or at the front or at home, that needed to be present, or whether it was just individual women who were super important in the conflict. And that is, that is a bit of my own, politics, I guess, creeping into the design, but it's more so, I think, just a reflection of that. With hindsight, the Spanish Revolution was a very important moment, particularly for Spanish women, in seizing control of their own lives and their own political lives. And there are a lot of games about the Spanish Civil War that are primarily war games, and you're not going to see that in those games. You're just going to see conflicts and battles. Um, and that's one of the things that really sets my game apart, is that we are also focusing on these social and economic issues, which in some ways have more lasting importance to how this conflict has resonated through the decades.
Interesting. You also mentioned that earlier that the Spanish Civil War is very controversial and that it tends to provoke a lot of different reactions. So what kinds of reactions have there been to your game and its presentation of history? And have any of them surprised you?
That's a great question. I mean, so like the game just came out, and I think there's probably going to be more reactions that will be interesting and surprising. Up to this point, most of the reaction has been really positive. I think people have been uh, enjoying the gameplay a lot, and that makes me happy as a game designer. That's my main job, is to make something that's fun to play. As far as the controversy or politics, I mean, this is explicitly an anti-fascist game, right? All the players are working together against fascism. And unfortunately, fascism is still a present danger in our time, 85 years later. So, there are people who are ideologically more committed to fascism, let's say, than committed to democracy. And those type of people do play games sometimes. And so those people might be, seeing this game on their radar, and they might have a very negative reaction to an anti-fascist board game. Particularly if it's not, including their perspective as like a playable, faction in the game. I will say though that the game is not shy about the warts of the Republic being shown as well. So it's not as if I'm just whitewashing to make the Republican factions seem all great and perfect, and the fascist, 100% evil. There's more nuance than that. There are cards in the fascist deck which make interesting points about the failings of the Republic, and particularly when it comes to race and the relationship of the Republic with the Moroccan, with Spanish Morocco, which was a colony of Spain at the time, and many other issues as well. But yeah, it is an anti-fascist game, and so there are occasional random sort of comments online that you're going to see of people who are, not happy about that, to say the least. But personally, I'm not overly concerned about that. I'm not. I didn't want the game to include. I didn't want players to have to play the fascists, and that was an important choice for me.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about that. Originally there was a playable fascist faction in this game. What led you to cut it ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the simple answer is, as soon as I figured out a way to cut them and make them just an automated deck of cards, or 3 decks of cards, that's what I did. But in playtesting early versions of the game, there were some playtests I had where people felt very uncomfortable playing as there were actually 2 different fascist factions. But that, I didn't like that, right? I didn't want to make a game where I was forcing people to have to play a anti-democratic and, repressive faction in that way. And so as soon as I figured out a way to get rid of it, and just make it focus on what I really wanted the game to focus on, which was this anti-fascist fragile alliance of the 3 Republican factions, that's what I did. But yeah, there were definitely some uncomfortable moments when, in very early versions, I was like, okay, and you're going to play, a fascist faction, and you could just see like the discomfort that caused, and I didn't like it either. So as soon as I could get rid of it, I did.
I like it. I like it. So 2 more questions before we just go into fluff. One, if somebody wants to kind of understand more about the Spanish Civil War, other than playing your game, which I found quite instructive, what should their first stop be for reading or watching to learn more about the situation?
That's a great question. For watching, I guess I'll start there. So the name of my game is Land and Freedom. There's a really excellent film called Land and Freedom that was directed by Ken Loach that came out in 1995, which is about a British worker who volunteers to fight in Spain. And, Ken Loach does a really great job of showing the not just the war, but all the political debates that were going on between the different factions and between different political tendencies, but also like even between the different militia fighters, of what they should do. Should they collectivize the land? All these kind of questions. Really awesome movie. As far as reading, uh, Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell is like the first place that I went that really attached me to the history. But as far as if you want more of a general history, um, you could, I think, two good recommendations. One is Helen Graham put out a book called A Very Short Introduction of the Spanish Civil War, I believe. That is like 150 pages and just, gives a good overview of the conflict, but also like the role of women and the sexual revolution and all the different complexities of the women involved in the militias and how the government used that as a propaganda tool and a recruitment tool and so forth. Quite a lot of really good stuff in that book. And then along with that, there's, I mentioned Mujeres Libres, the Free Women of Spain. There's an excellent history of that group by Martha Ecclesburg that came out in the 90s. And it's just called Free Women of Spain. And, gives a whole history of Mujeres Libres and also the anarchist movement in Spain.
Awesome. I'll be looking this up shortly. The other question I have for you. So, I obviously hope it's not 5 years until your next game, although if that's what it takes, then it's what it takes. Because, like, honestly, you made something beautiful with this.
Oh, thanks.
But what is your next design, if you have one? Are you willing to tell us?
Yeah, I have several. So I'll bore you with all the details, but the very next one that probably will come out is just a very simple cooperative card game called Strike, which is just a simple card game of working together to convince your coworkers to go on strike in like a modern workplace environment. Hopefully that will be out maybe next year. It's already finished. And then more recently, I'm working on a design about the radical abolitionist movement in the 1850s, before the Civil War, to try to end slavery. And it follows the story of John Brown, who, most notorious anti-racist in US history, along his journey from Bleeding, Kansas in the 1850s up to his failed raid in Harper's Ferry in 1859. Through his journey, the game follows, kind of weaves together all the different radical abolitionist figures in the North and their schemes and so forth to try to end slavery in a time when the government was very much controlled by the Southern slaveholding power. And so that's a really exciting project that I'm working on right now. It's still unsigned, so if there's any publishers out there, hit me up. But it's a campaign game. It's a cooperative campaign game. So it's kind of there's 8 missions in the game, and each mission kind of builds into the next one. So you get more and more locations and cards and abilities and so forth, as you kind of build out the entire landscape of the 1850s.
Awesome. I'm genuinely excited about playing these, so keep us updated. And then just a couple softy questions. What are you playing for fun right now?
Well, I just got my copy of Resist by David Thompson, so I'm going to bust that one out today. Really excited about that. Lately, I played Stonewall Uprising by Taylor Schuss, which is a really awesome design about the LGBT movement of the 60s through 80s. And on the lighter side, there's a game called Spots, which is just a simple dice game that a friend of mine here in Philadelphia, John Perry, designed. Really cool, simple push your luck. It's actually available on Board Game Arena right now on BGA if you play on there. Just a quick dice game. So I recommend that as well.
Oh, that sounds fun. And then if people want to follow your work or, ask you questions or just kind of see what you're up to, where can be found online?
So yeah, on Twitter, it's just Land and Freedom 1. I have an Instagram as well, which is Land and Freedom Games. And on that, I've been posting some of the cards in the game, as well as like a lot of the history behind those cards, and wanting to sort of give a little bit more context for why certain aspects or cards are in the game, and more information if people want to learn more than I could, more history than I could squeeze just on each and every card. So if you're interested in that, Land of Freedom Games on Instagram.
Fantastic. And I, of course, can be found anywhere online as Beyond Solitaire, which hopefully everybody listening to this podcast knows by now. Alex, thank you so much for coming on. This is a great conversation. I'm looking forward to your future work, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me, Liz. It was really fun.
All right, y'all. So people who are out there listening, please don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.